Padre Pio saw a soul stop waiting. He saw chains loosen where nothing had moved for a long time. It happened the moment a single Hail Mary reached a place it was never meant to reach. The soul did not cry out. It simply turned, as if a door had quietly opened behind it. Padre Pio felt the shift before he understood it. What he witnessed was not punishment ending, but direction beginning. A prayer had changed where a soul was going. And once that movement started, nothing could reverse it. The chapel that afternoon was neither crowded nor empty. It carried the quiet density of a place that had absorbed decades of whispered petitions, confessions spoken under breath, and hopes that never found language. Light filtered through narrow windows and settled unevenly on the stone floor. Nothing in the room suggested interruption. Nothing warned of consequence. Padre Pio knelt near the side altar, as he often did when the church grew still. His posture was steady, his breathing slow and measured. The rosary rested loosely in his hands, the beads unmoving, not because prayer had stopped, but because attention had deepened. He was not reciting words mechanically. He was listening. Years of discipline had trained this attentiveness. He had learned that grace rarely arrived loudly. More often, it pressed inward, subtle, unmistakable, heavy with meaning. That pressure appeared suddenly, without warning. Not fear, not pain, recognition. Something had shifted. Not in the visible world, but beyond it. Something had responded. A soul had been reached. Earlier that same day, long before Padre Pio knelt in silence, a woman had entered through a side door of the church. She did not look like someone accustomed to sacred spaces. Her steps were hesitant. Her gaze avoided the altar instinctively. She stood near the back wall, close to the shadows, careful not to draw attention. No one noticed her arrival. The friars passed without a glance. Its posture leaned, almost imperceptibly. Padre Pio felt his breath catch. Grace had not removed the burden. It had given direction. At the soul's feet, something appeared, thin, almost invisible chains. They had not been noticeable until they began to loosen. They did not break. They relaxed, as if their authority had weakened. The soul lifted its head for the first time. Padre Pio felt tears gather behind his eyes. He understood the reality clearly now, not as theory, but as witness. Heaven does not measure prayer by eloquence. It does not respond to confidence or clarity of speech. It responds to sincerity. One single Hail Mary, spoken without belief in its effectiveness, had altered the interior gravity of a soul. The waiting was no longer static. It leaned toward movement. The soul had not entered heaven, but it was no longer standing still. Padre Pio opened his eyes. The chapel remained unchanged. Candles burned steadily. Silence held its place. Yet his hands trembled. He lowered his head and whispered, "Thank you, not for the vision, for the mercy that continued to work unseen." He remained kneeling long after the pressure faded. He understood that what he had seen was not a conclusion, but a beginning. Grace rarely completed its work in a single motion. That evening, as the friars moved quietly through the monastery corridors, Padre Pio did not sleep. Not from restlessness, but from attentiveness. He sensed that what had been set in motion would continue unfolding. And it did. 3 nights later, while seated alone in his cell, the awareness returned. Not suddenly, gently. Something passed near him, not toward him, but beyond him. Like a soul being carried further than before. The vision opened again. The same place of waiting, but altered. The soul now stood closer to a presence it could sense but not yet see. The longing no longer burned sharply. It leaned with patience. The chains were thinner now, less certain, as if they no longer fully belonged to the soul. Padre Pio understood immediately. The single Hail Mary had begun the work. But mercy rarely acts in isolation. Another prayer entered that place. Not intentional, not directed. A distracted prayer spoken by someone asking, almost absent-mindedly, for the souls who had no one to pray for them. The prayer arrived without form, like a second hand resting gently over the first. The chains responded. One link dissolved entirely. The soul staggered, not from pain, but from surprise. It had not expected further movement so soon. Padre Pio felt awe settle heavily in his chest. Heaven gathers what earth forgets. The soul did not speak. Words were unnecessary. Gratitude reshaped its posture more clearly than language ever could. It turned fully toward the presence it could now sense. Movement toward heaven had begun, not because of worthiness, not because of justice, because someone had remembered. Padre Pio remained seated long after the vision faded. This was not imagination. This was not symbolism. This was spiritual reality. And it carried weight. Buried within the silence of that monastery, a soul continued its journey. And somewhere in the world, a woman lived on, unaware that one whispered prayer had already begun to change eternity. The vision did not return immediately after that second movement. Days passed, then weeks. Life inside the monastery continued with its familiar rhythm, indifferent to what had been set in motion beyond sight. Morning bells echoed through stone corridors. Meals were eaten in silence. Confessions began and ended without ceremony. Prayer filled the hours, spoken aloud and carried inward. Yet for Padre Pio, nothing was the same. He no longer experienced prayer as something that ended when the words stopped. He experienced it as something that continued moving long after the voice had fallen silent. Every Hail Mary spoken within the church now carried a subtle weight, not because of volume or devotion, but because of possibility. He had seen too clearly to doubt it. Prayer did not disappear. It traveled. He began to notice how differently prayers arrived. Some prayers came burdened with desperation, heavy with expectation. Others came distracted, almost careless, spoken while minds wandered elsewhere. But the ones that reached deepest were rarely the strongest. They were the most honest. A Hail Mary whispered by a man fighting sleep during night prayer. Another murmured by a woman leaving Mass early, already thinking of her children. A single prayer spoken without faith, but with need. Padre Pio understood now that prayer did not require clarity of intention. It required truth of heart. Truth, he had learned, often spoke quietly. The soul he had seen did not leave his awareness. It was not an image that haunted him, nor a memory he replayed. It was a certainty that lived beneath everything else. He did not seek further visions. He did not ask for confirmation. And yet, they came. Always gently. Always without warning. One night, while kneeling alone in the chapel long after Compline, Padre Pio felt the familiar pressure return. Not sharp, not urgent, assured. The unseen opened once more. The place of waiting had changed again. It was no longer defined by stillness. Movement now shaped it fully. The soul stood upright, no longer tentative, no longer uncertain. It was not striving toward heaven, nor standing at a distance. It was ready. Padre Pio perceived something surrounding the soul that had not been visible before. Memory, not accusation, not punishment, truth. Scenes from the soul's earthly life emerged gently, one by one. Moments of cruelty spoken without thought. Moments of love withheld out of fear. Moments when silence had replaced mercy. Each memory surfaced without resistance. Each was acknowledged. Each was released. Padre Pio understood then what purification truly was. It was not suffering inflicted from without. It was surrender from within. The soul no longer defended its past. It no longer argued with grace. It entrusted everything it had been. That surrender completed what suffering alone never could. Another prayer entered the unseen place. This time, Padre Pio recognized its origin immediately. A small group of elderly women praying the rosary slowly in a side chapel. Their voices uneven, some distracted, some tired, some barely audible. They prayed without urgency. They prayed out of habit, out of faith carried longer than strength. Hail Mary, full of grace. The words echoed faintly in the stone church. In the unseen realm, the prayer arrived not as a spark, but as a steady current. It did not disturb the soul. It carried it. The memories lost their remaining weight. They no longer resisted release. They no longer demanded attention. Padre Pio felt a deep stillness settle within him. This was not pain. This was trust. The soul stepped closer to the threshold of light. Not hurried. Not pulled. Invited. For the first time, Padre Pio sensed clearly the presence that had guided every movement without ever forcing one. Maternal. Attentive. Unmistakable. The Hail Marys did not end in the soul. They passed through her. Mary, not as vision, not as apparition, as mediation. She gathered what had been offered sincerely. She carried it where it was needed most. She did not measure devotion. She measured honesty. The soul hesitated briefly at the threshold, not from fear, but humility. Then it surrendered completely. The vision closed slowly, without spectacle. Padre Pio remained kneeling long after it faded. His hands rested on the cold stone floor. His breathing slowed. Words felt unnecessary. What he had witnessed was not a single moment. It was a completed process. And that knowledge carried weight. In the days that followed, Padre Pio noticed a change within himself. He became slower to speak in the confessional, more patient with silence, less eager to instruct. He understood now that conversion rarely happened through explanation. It unfolded through small openings sustained over time. When penitents struggled to pray, he did not urge them toward longer devotions. He did not burden them with expectations. Say what you can, he would tell them quietly. God understands the rest. These words were not consolation. They were truth earned through witness. The memory of the woman returned to him often. She would never know what her prayer had set in motion. She would never be told that a soul had moved because of her whisper. And that anonymity was essential. Grace did not require acknowledgement, only availability. Padre Pio prayed for her in silence, not as reward, but as protection. Humility, he had learned, was fragile. Years passed. His body weakened. Pain became constant. Speech grew costly. But prayer did not diminish. When his hands trembled too much to hold the rosary, the friars guided the beads for him. His lips still formed the words. Each Hail Mary was spoken slowly now, not out of habit, out of awareness. He no longer experienced prayer as repetition. He experienced it as movement through eternity. The friars noticed that he paused longer during the Hail Mary at Mass. Not deliberately, not theatrically, as if listening. Once, when a young friar asked him why, Padre Pio answered simply, "Because heaven listens very closely at that moment." He said no more. On one of his final nights, when sleep would not come, Padre Pio felt a quiet certainty settle within him. The soul he had seen was no longer waiting. He did not see the moment of entry. He did not need to. Peace carried the confirmation. He whispered one final Hail Mary, not for a soul in purgatory, but in gratitude, for what heaven had allowed him to see, for the truth he would carry silently until death. That truth was simple. No sincere prayer is ever wasted, especially the smallest one. A single Hail Mary, spoken without confidence, without clarity, without hope, had moved what effort alone could not. It had not forced heaven's hand. It had opened a door, and heaven had stepped through. Somewhere beyond sight, a soul rested in light. Somewhere on earth, a woman lived her life unaware of the eternal consequence of a moment she had already forgotten. And within the quiet walls of a monastery, a man carried the memory of what he had seen, not as a story to tell, but as a responsibility to honor. Because once you have seen what one sincere prayer can do, you can never listen the same way again.